1973 Ford Pinto. The crash speed was Pinto mixed with water from the Datsun's fractured radiator. Tank, still leaking.
You're hearing today is a story of corporate callousness at the highest levels of the Ford Motor Company. A callousness expressed by President Lee Iacocca, who knew both before the sale of the Pintos and during the sale of the Pintos that the fuel tank was in a very vulnerable position and could lead to the fiery deaths and injuries of Pinto occupants in case of a rear-end collision by another car at speeds as low as 21 or 22 miles per hour.
Of the current Pinto. In order at the time was rushing the car into production to compete with the fast-growing Volkswagen. Assembly line machinery was already tooled when this defect was discovered. Top Ford officials decided to manufacture the car anyway, exploding gas tank and all, even though Ford owned, at the time, the patent on a much safer fuel system. For close to 8 years after this decision was made, Ford lobbied vigorously against the federal safety standard that would have forced the company to change the Pinto's gas tank configuration.
This 1973 Ford Pinto is about to suffer a rear-end collision at 38 miles an hour. The impact drives the gasoline tank forward into the differential, causing a rupture, spilling gas. Any spark and the tank explodes. Today, a West Coast investigative reporter, backed by Ralph Nader, charged that 2 million pre-1977 Pintos currently on U.S. roads are potential death traps. Since introduction of the Pintos in 1971, they charged, 500 burning deaths and thousands of serious burn injuries have resulted from unsafe Pinto fuel tanks.
The story that you're hearing today is a story of corporate callousness at the highest levels of the Ford Motor Company. A callousness expressed by President Lee Iacocca, who knew both before the sale of the Pintos and during the sale of the Pintos that the fuel tank was in a very vulnerable position and could lead to the fiery deaths and injuries of Pinto occupants in case of a rear-end collision by another car at speeds as low as 21 or 22 miles per hour.
Nader acknowledged that 1977 Pinto fuel tanks have been modified by the insertion of this plastic shield, which absorbs impact in rear-end crashes. But he called on the Department of Transportation to issue a recall on all pre-1977 Pintos for retrofitting. Ford says it is studying the charges, which it said is filled with distortions and half-truths, and will respond later. DOT has called for the magazine's documents and says it will launch its own investigation. Bill Matney, ABC News, Washington. The sweeping charges against the second-largest automaker, Ford, came at this news conference, called by a consumer-oriented magazine and supported by Ralph Nader. They said 2 million pre-1977 Ford Pintos are potential death traps, that their fuel tanks, rupturing in rear-end collisions, as seen in this demonstration film, have been responsible for at least 500 burning deaths and thousands of serious burn injuries. Investigative reporter Mark Dowie said Ford executives knew of the defect while the first models were on the assembly line, but decided to go ahead anyway.
Because the company at the time was rushing the car into production to compete with the fast-growing Volkswagen, assembly line machinery was already tooled when this defect was discovered. Top Ford officials decided to manufacture the car anyway, exploding gas tank and all, even though Ford owned, at the time, the patent on a much safer fuel system. For close to 8 years after this decision was made, Ford lobbied vigorously against the federal safety standard that would have forced the company to change the Pinto's gas tank configuration.
Ford has modified its 1977 Pinto models with a plastic shield placed between the fuel tank and the differential only inches away. But Nader wants all the other Pintos in use today recalled by Ford for retrofitting. Ford called the charges half-truths and distortions. The Department of Transportation said it will study the allegations. Bill Matney, ABC News, Washington.
Is this on now? Okay, we're going to start. On my immediate right is Mark Dowie, the author of the piece. He's going to make a short opening statement. Then we're going to have Ralph Nader. Byron Block, who is an automobile safety consultant, is here to answer technical questions and will be available. Then we're going to throw it open for questions after the two speakers.
Good afternoon. During the past 2 years, Mother Jones Magazine and its publisher, the Foundation for National Progress in San Francisco, has conducted extensive research on corporate decision-making. A recent investigation of high-level policy formulation in the automotive industry as it relates to vehicle safety has uncovered an astonishing case study in the Ford Motor Company. Briefly, we discovered that high-level Ford engineers learned in pre-production crash tests that rear. Okay, now, this chart here illustrates the normal production planning and engineering of an automobile. General Motors, AMC already have the statement, claiming that our story is full of distortions and half-truths. That's a quote right from his statement. In light of the fact that our story is based almost entirely on Ford crash tests, Ford internal documents, and interviews with Ford employees, we find it difficult to take such a statement seriously and invite the company to provide documented proof that we are in any way incorrect. Finally, we call on the Department of Transportation and their sub-agency, National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, to begin an immediate investigation of this tragic defect, and in light of what we are convinced they will find, we ask that they order a recall of all pre-1977 Pintos for retrofitting of safer fuel tanks. Now, I'm going to put out on the table for you to take after this press conference a package of documents that I refer to in the article. It includes crash tests. It includes two key internal Ford memoranda. It includes a correspondence between myself and the Ford Motor Company, in which basically they refused to answer all my technical questions. This was a very difficult story to investigate. And several other documents that I think will be of interest to you. The crash tests are important. I've only given you 2 crash tests at this point. They're very important because they were performed a day apart. The one that passed at 31 miles an hour was on a Capri-type tank, which is the tank that is a much safer tank, on which they have a patent. At 31 miles an hour, it passed. The next day, they performed a crash test at 21 miles an hour on the Pinto, and it failed. Okay? Now, I'm going to turn the conference at this point over to Ralph Nader and ask him to make a statement, and then we'll open it up to questions. And if any of the questions are highly technical, we have an expert here who designed this diagram here, Byron Block, and he can answer technical questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I've come across a Ford promotion for the new Ford Fiesta. And in one of the pages of the promotion, under the word safety, there's a statement that says, fuel tank located forward of the rear axle to avoid spillage in the event of collision. Forward of the rear axle. These Pintos, the evidence of death and injury on the highway in fiery Pinto crashes continue to build up. The Ford Motor Company added a total of 3 million of these cars to the highways and byways of the country before even the most modest cosmetic change was made in the 1977 Pinto cars, which are still vulnerable, but not quite as much. Instead of correcting this danger to millions of American Pinto owners and occupants, Ford unleashed its lobbyists against the Department of Transportation to delay for the better part of 8 years an attempt by our government to establish a modest safety standard for fuel tank positioning, a standard that would at least protect people if the car was rear-ended at relatively low speeds. Ford succeeded, with the help of the Nixon-Ford administration, in delaying this fuel tank standard year after year. The question is to what extent corrective action should be made. First and foremost, Ford Motor Company should voluntarily recall all 3 million Pinto automobiles with the vulnerable fuel tanks right near the rear bumper, and install fuel cells in these fuel tanks at a very modest cost, as the present Corvette has, for example, in its fuel tank. Lacking the voluntary recognition of its duty, the U.S. government should, or in order to cover up a bad engineering design. I'd like to say in conclusion that the Ford Motor Company's response to these disclosures, as predictable as they may be, illustrate the utter inability of the top executives of Ford Motor Company, Lee Iacocca and Henry Ford, in behaving like human beings, like people who care about people on the highway, about people who are being exposed to a process of victimization in order to keep Ford Motor Company's profits at a few higher dollar levels. I think it's also important to note that there are more insiders in Ford Motor Company who will be coming up with more information, and it'll be very interesting to see the extent to which Ford wants to risk its future shattered credibility. More and more people in the auto companies are coming forward with documents, crash tests, and evidence in order to fulfill their humanitarian goal of no longer subjecting themselves to the managerial dictates of callous corporate executives. And this is just the beginning of the latest stage of a flow of information from inside the auto companies that will develop the external pressures, governmental and consumer, to try to solve this problem of auto safety, as our engineers and scientists know can be solved at a very reasonable cost. Thank you.
Okay, are there any questions?
How did you come up with the death figure?
The estimate of 500? Well, as I say, it's our estimate. We began with the Department of Transportation estimate of 22 to 3,500 fire-related deaths on the highway every year. We took the Pinto market penetration over the same 6 years that we're talking about, and took a percentage of the Pintos on the road of the 3,500, came to about 70 deaths a year. We estimated were in Pintos. Keep in mind that doesn't mean that 70 Pintos blew up every year, because there's usually more than one person in a car when it blew up, and when they blow up, there's usually more than one death. Yes?
How did you obtain the figures on crash tests?
How did I obtain the figures?
The crash test information, were they sneaked out to you in the same way?
I'm not at liberty to reveal how I received crash tests. Some of the crash tests, incidentally, are public records. They've been filed in product liability cases against the company.
Moving on a defect recall policy by the Department of Transportation. Notice also should be made of $1 million verdicts that have been brought against the Ford Motor Company based on evidence at trial, and a large number of cases which Ford Motor Company has settled, although we don't know exactly how many cases are involved because they have refused to divulge that information. But much of the information was also obtained through legal process in the course of litigation. So not only is this situation below the capability of the auto industry, not only is it below the industry standard at the time, but it's even below the standard of other Ford cars. Yeah.
How do you compare the danger in the Pinto to the dangers in the Corvair?
There's no way of, comparing them in a precise manner, because we don't have that kind of data in this country. The Corvair has a carbon monoxide problem, which General Motors recognized, leaking into the passenger compartment. It has a handling problem, which now we learn that the Vice President of General Motors, John DeLorean, has confirmed from inside the company, in addition to proving ground tests. And it has a steering column ramming back into the driver problem, because the steering point that Ford stalled and blocked the Department of Transportation on the fuel tank standard for a number of years, which General Motors didn't do because the law wasn't underway at that time, particularly dealing with handling standards.
Pinto owners can do now to change the situation in their own cars?
Right now, what they've got to do, other than take whatever care they can in the highway, what they've got to do is go down to their Ford dealer and individually demand that the fuel tank be implanted with a fuel cell, which is relatively easy and would cost a few dollars in mass production, and put the pressure on the dealer just the way Oldsmobile owners and Cadillac owners put pressure on the GM dealers when they found they had Chevy engines. This will generate local news coverage, which will generate national news coverage, which will perhaps begin the process of Pinto owners organizing as a force in order to get the correction of this problem done as fast as possible at Ford Motor Company expense. That's what they can do, and they can also write the Secretary of Transportation Brock Adams and their senators and representatives. Short of that, their only option is to get rid of the car. That, of course, in the used car market, simply foists it on someone else.
I can tell you that at this point, I'm not an engineer, nor am I, yeah, I know, I'm going to ask you to do it, Byron. I cannot right now answer that question authoritatively, but I'm going to ask Byron Block if he has an answer for it.
The answer, sadly, is yes. A lot of cars are somewhat similar to the Pinto. One that comes to mind, of course, is the Chevrolet Vega, which is somewhat akin to the Ford Pinto. The Ford Pinto is to the Ford Motor Company as the Chevrolet Vega is to General Motors. And the same type of problems apply to the Vega. There are puncture sources all around the Vega fuel tank, much like having beer can openers aimed at the tank. So in a rear impact or a right side rear quarter impact, holes are punched in the tank is pushed forward into the shock absorber, the differential, a lot of sharp edges. Yes. In some foreign cars, however, where they probably were not so aware of the effect of lobbying a delay in a rear impact crash test, some of the Japanese cars and European cars in the same class as the Pinto adopted fuel tanks above the rear axle, and some have adopted it in front of the rear axle, like the new Ford Fiesta.
My understanding is you're saying that the Vega could be as dangerous as the Pinto.
Yeah, it's quite similar in having a fuel tank located very close to the rear bumper in a very inadequately structured rear body with a lot of puncture sources around it. And their own reports would point this out.
Are you saying that it's possible to build a car of that small size to avoid this problem?
$50,000 to Nixon in the Nixon campaign. You can interpret that any way you want, but there is direct control from the White House in that matter.
See, to initiate a defect investigation, you have to suspect a defect. In order to suspect a defect, the part of the car has to be in violation of a standard or defectively constructed. Ford Motor Company blocked the standard and thereby eliminated that reference point, leaving the less precise judgment as to what constitutes a defect in a fuel tank positioning against prevailing industry standards. So, in effect, Ford ensured that the Auto Safety Agency would not have the more precise standard against which to measure this problem. Secondly, when you decide what a defect is, one interesting approach is to go to the patent literature. In October 31, 1961, Ford Motor Company obtained a patent which was submitted in 1956 for a saddle-type fuel tank, which was not used in the Pinto design over 10 years later. So Ford was certainly on notice and had the technical patent that could have produced a safer design. Thirdly, the courts have ruled a defect per se theory that the Auto Safety Agency. Of course, in addition to, I'm sure, as of tonight, most of the Pinto owners will hear about this problem, and I hope that they will be able to mobilize themselves individually and together as a group, because they're not only fighting their fight, they're fighting the fight of many other car owners who have been exposed to these kinds of callous decisions. The Department of Transportation, of course, if it doesn't on its own, will be asked formally to investigate this problem. If it doesn't think that the law, as amended, is of a sufficient facility, they will be asked to recommend amendments to Congress, including criminal penalties and a more readily available manner of declaring design defects defects, in contrast to construction defects.
Who will make the formal request?
Oh, we will. You know, I'll make the request if it's necessary. I mean, it shouldn't be necessary because they're here today. They've got the information. Only if we see that they're not going to initiate an inquiry will we make a formal petition before the Department of Transportation.
Yes, sir.
I have a
If anybody incidentally does not get documents, I notice we've run out of some of them, please see Amanda Spake, and we'll have them delivered to you, okay? Thank you for coming. Thank you, Ralph.
Gentlemen,